I never thought I'd witness my own son desecrate his father's memory at the very altar where we'd exchanged vows 34 years ago. But there I stood, watching Henry walk into St. Mary's Cathedral with her, the woman whose mere existence had shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage to Louis. The autumn rain drummed against the stained glass windows as mourners filed into the pews, their black umbrellas creating a sea of grief in the church parking lot. I stood at the front, my hands trembling as I clutched a tissue that had long since become useless. The casket, mahogany, just as Louis had requested, sat closed before the altar, surrounded by wreaths of white lilies and red roses. Our friends from the neighborhood, colleagues from the accounting firm where Louis had built his reputation over 3 decades, and a handful of distant relatives filled the sanctuary with their whispered condolences and sympathetic glances. At 68, I thought I understood heartbreak. I'd buried my parents, weathered financial struggles, and supported Louis through his battle with lung cancer. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what was about to unfold in that sacred space. Mother, the word cut through the hushed conversations like a blade. I turned, my heart already sinking, to see Henry standing in the center aisle. At 35, my son had inherited his father's strong jawline and piercing blue eyes. But today, those eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. Beside him stood a woman I recognized only from photographs I'd discovered hidden in Louis's desk drawer just weeks before his death. Victoria Sterling, tall, elegant, with honey blonde hair styled in a perfect chignon. She wore a form-fitting black dress that seemed more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral, and her red lipstick was a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere. But it was her expression that made my blood run cold. Not grief, not even sympathy, but something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "This is the woman who truly mattered in Dad's life," Henry announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent church. "The woman who understood him in ways you never could." The words hit me like physical blows. I felt my knees buckle slightly, and I gripped the edge of the front pew to steady myself. Around us, I could hear the soft gasps and murmurs of shock from our friends and family. Mrs. Henderson from next door covered her mouth with her hands. Louis's business partner, Robert, half rose from his seat as if to intervene, then seemed to think better of it. "Henry, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the pounding of my heart. "Not here, not today." But my son's face remained stone cold as he approached me, Victoria gliding silently beside him like some beautiful predatory bird. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a cream-colored envelope, its edges pristine despite the tremor in his hands. "This contains everything you need to know about your future," he said, his tone so clinical it was almost businesslike. "The house on Maple Street, the one where you raised me, where you thought you'd live out your golden years, it's no longer yours. Dad made sure of that." I stared at the envelope as if it might burst into flames in my hands. "What are you talking about?" Victoria stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume. Jasmine and something else, something sharp and synthetic. When she leaned in, her voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for my ears. "I've been waiting for this moment for 7 long years," she breathed. "Louis promised me that when the time came, everything would be mine. The house, the accounts, even his son's loyalty." She pulled back just enough for me to see the triumph glittering in her green eyes. "He kept his word." The funeral service passed in a haze of disbelief and mounting horror. I sat in what should have been the widow's pew, but somehow Victoria had positioned herself where I belonged, graciously accepting condolences from mourners who didn't know any better. Henry sat beside her, his arm protectively around her shoulders, while I found myself relegated to the second row like some distant relative. Pastor Mitchell delivered a beautiful eulogy about Lewis's dedication to his family and his community service, but every word felt like mockery. How could he speak of a loving husband and father when the man's mistress was sitting in the front row, basking in the attention that should have been mine? When the service ended and the last of the mourners had offered their awkward condolences, their eyes darting between me and Victoria with obvious confusion, I found myself standing alone in the parking lot. The rain had stopped, but gray clouds still hung low over the cemetery where we'd just laid Louis to rest. Henry and Victoria were already walking toward a sleek black Mercedes I'd never seen before. He turned back once, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and bad dreams. But then Victoria said something in his ear, and his expression hardened again. "Henry, wait," I called out, hurrying across the wet pavement in my black heels. "Please, son, we need to talk about this. There has to be some mistake." He stopped but didn't turn around. The only mistake, Mother, was believing Dad's lies about what kind of woman you really were. But that's over now. Victoria helped me see the truth. What truth? I was nearly breathless, both from running and from the crushing weight of confusion and grief. "What has she told you?" Now he did turn, and the look on his face was one I'd never forget, a mixture of disgust and pity that cut deeper than any anger could have. "She didn't have to tell me anything. Dad showed me the evidence himself, before he got too sick. The affairs, the secret spending, the lies, all of it." His voice cracked slightly, and I realized that whatever he believed about me, it was causing him pain too. "I know who you really are now." As they drove away, leaving me standing alone in the empty parking lot beside my 12-year-old Honda, I felt something inside me crack wide open. Not just my heart, but my entire understanding of reality. Because whatever Henry thought he knew about me, whatever Lewis had told him, it was all wrong. I had never been unfaithful, never spent money recklessly, never lied about anything significant in our marriage, which meant that either my husband of 34 years had lost his mind in his final months, or he had deliberately destroyed my relationship with our son for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. The envelope in my purse felt heavier than lead as I drove home through the quiet suburban streets we'd called home for most of our marriage. Whatever was inside would either explain this nightmare or make it infinitely worse. But first, I needed to understand how the man I'd loved and trusted for more than half my life had managed to turn my own child against me with lies I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The house felt like a mausoleum when I finally pulled into our driveway on Maple Street. Every window seemed to stare down at me with accusation, as if the very walls knew secrets I'd been too blind to see. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the red brick colonial where Henry had taken his first steps, where Lewis and I had celebrated 33 anniversaries, where I'd nursed my husband through his final agonizing months. The envelope from Henry lay beside me on the passenger seat, still unopened. Part of me wanted to drive away and never come back, to pretend this was all some terrible nightmare from which I'd eventually wake. But at 68, with arthritis beginning to settle in my joints and a heart that felt shattered beyond repair, I had nowhere else to go. Inside, the silence was deafening. The house still smelled faintly of the lilies from Lewis's wake 2 days ago, mixed with the lingering scent of his aftershave that seemed to cling to everything he'd touched. I made my way to the kitchen, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors we'd refinished together just 5 years earlier, back when we were planning for retirement, talking about growing old together in this house. My hands shook as I finally tore open the envelope. Inside were legal documents with official seals and signatures, filled with language I barely understood. But certain phrases jumped out at me with brutal clarity: transfer of property, revision of last will and testament, beneficiary Henry James Patterson, monthly stipend $800. $800. After 34 years of marriage, after putting Lewis through graduate school while working 2 jobs, after giving up my own career ambitions to support his rise through the ranks at Morrison and Associates, I was worth $800 a month to the man I'd loved. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the same maple dining set we'd bought when Henry was in elementary school, and read through the documents again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the legal language was clear. Lewis had changed his will 3 years ago, leaving the house, his life insurance policy, his retirement accounts, and his share of the accounting firm to Henry. The only provision for me was that monthly stipend, barely enough to rent a studio apartment in the cheaper part of town. The worst part was a clause near the bottom that made my stomach lurch. In consideration of Christine Patterson's demonstrated financial irresponsibility and marital infidelity, this revised will reflects the testator's desire to protect family assets for the benefit of his son. Financial irresponsibility, marital infidelity. The words swam before my eyes. In 34 years of marriage, I'd never so much as looked at another man with romantic interest. As for finances, Lewis had insisted on handling all our money matters himself, saying it was too stressful for me to worry about. I trusted him completely, never questioning his decisions, never even asking to see our bank statements. The sound of a key in the front door made me jump. I quickly folded the papers and shoved them back into the envelope, my heart racing. Had Henry come back? Was he here to throw me out immediately? But when the door opened, it was Victoria who walked in, followed by Henry carrying 2 large suitcases. She moved through my home with the casual confidence of someone who already owned it, her high heels clicking authoritatively across the floors I'd mopped countless times. "I hope you've had time to process everything," Henry said, his voice carefully neutral as he set down the luggage in the foyer. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and I wondered if somewhere deep down he still felt ashamed of what he was doing. "Henry, please." I stood up, my legs unsteady. "Can we talk about this, just you and me? There are things about your father you don't understand." "What I understand," Victoria interrupted, walking into the kitchen as if she'd lived here for years, "is that this house now belongs to Henry, and you're trespassing." She opened the refrigerator and wrinkled her nose at its contents. "We'll need to throw all this old food away and start fresh." The casual cruelty of her words, dismissing my life as old food to be discarded, hit me harder than any physical blow could have. This was my kitchen, where I'd packed Henry's school lunches for 12 years, where I'd taught him to bake his first chocolate chip cookies, where Lewis and I had shared quiet morning coffees and late-night conversations about our dreams for the future. "You have until tomorrow evening to pack your personal belongings," Victoria continued, running her finger along the counter and examining it for dust. "Henry's been generous enough to give you extra time, considering the circumstances." "What circumstances?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Henry finally looked at me directly, and the pain in his eyes was almost worse than his anger had been. "Dad told me everything, Mom, about the credit cards you maxed out, about the secret bank account you used to hide money from him, about the men you met while he was working late to pay for your spending. Each accusation was like a knife to my chest. Henry, none of that is true. None of it. Your father never told me about any credit card problems. I don't have any secret accounts, and I have never ever been unfaithful to him. But even as I spoke, I could see that my words weren't reaching him. His face had that closed-off expression I remembered from his teenage years, when he'd made up his mind about something and refused to listen to reason. Dad showed me the evidence, he said quietly. Bank statements with your signature on withdrawals you claimed you didn't make. Hotel receipts with your name on them from days when you said you were volunteering at the library. Photos of you with other men. Photos. My voice came out as a whisper. What photos? Victoria smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that made my skin crawl. The ones from your little rendezvous at the Riverside Inn. Very illuminating, weren't they? Henry. I felt the room spinning around me. The Riverside Inn was where Louis and I had celebrated our anniversary every year. We'd go there for dinner and sometimes spend the night in their honeymoon suite, laughing about being an old married couple trying to recapture romance. If there were photos of me there, they would have been with Louis, not some imaginary lover, unless a terrible thought began to form in my mind. What if Louis had deliberately taken me to places where he could photograph me, then somehow edited the pictures to make it look like I was with someone else? With today's technology, it would be easy enough to do. But why would he go to such elaborate lengths to frame me? I want to see these photos, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. That's not going to happen, Victoria said quickly. Henry's been through enough without having to relive his father's pain. If they exist, if they're real, then I have a right to see what I'm being accused of. Henry shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment I thought he might waver. But then Victoria moved closer to him, placing a possessive hand on his arm. Your mother is desperate, she said softly, but loud enough for me to hear. She'll say anything now to try to save herself. Louis warned us this might happen. The manipulation was so subtle, so expertly done, that I almost admired her skill even as it destroyed me. She was turning my own son against me in real time, using his grief and confusion as weapons. I need you both to leave, I said suddenly. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise them. This is still my home until tomorrow evening. According to your own timeline, I need time to think, to pack, to figure out where I'm going to live. Victoria's eyes flashed with annoyance. We're not leaving you alone in this house. Who knows what you might try to take that doesn't belong to you? Everything in this house belongs to me, I snapped, my composure finally cracking. I've lived here for 28 years. I chose every piece of furniture, planted every flower in the garden, painted every room. Just because your lover decided to steal it all from me doesn't mean I'm going to rob my own home. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Henry's face had gone pale, and I realized I'd just confirmed what he believed about my character, that I was volatile, unreasonable, capable of anything. We'll be back tomorrow morning, he said quietly. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. As they gathered their suitcases and headed for the door, I called out one last time. Henry, wait, please, just tell me one thing. When did your father show you this so-called evidence? When did he turn you against me? He paused in the doorway, his back to me. 3 years ago, right after he changed his will, he said he couldn't keep protecting you anymore, that I needed to know the truth about what kind of woman I'd been defending all my life. 3 years ago. The timing sent a chill down my spine. 3 years ago was when Louis had started working longer hours, claiming the firm was expanding. 3 years ago was when he'd begun taking those mysterious business trips, sometimes for days at a time. 3 years ago was when he'd started suggesting I might be happier volunteering at the church more often, getting me out of the house with increasing frequency. As the door closed behind them, leaving me alone in the gathering darkness, I realized that my husband's betrayal went far deeper than a simple affair. This had been planned, methodical, deliberate. For 3 years, he'd been systematically destroying my relationship with our son, preparing Henry to accept his lies, building a case against me that would justify stripping away everything I'd worked for, everything I'd believed was mine. But why? What could possibly have motivated the man I'd loved to orchestrate such an elaborate deception? And more importantly, how could I prove my innocence when the only person who knew the truth was lying 6 feet underground in Restwood Cemetery? The house creaked around me as night fell, and I found myself wondering if these walls held more secrets than I'd ever imagined. Tomorrow, I would lose my home, but tonight, I was going to search every inch of it for answers. Because if Louis had been living a double life for 3 years, there had to be evidence somewhere, and I was going to find it, even if it destroyed what little remained of my faith in the man I'd married. The house felt different in the darkness, as if shadows were hiding truths I'd been too trusting to see before. I moved through the rooms like a stranger, really looking at our home for the first time in years. Every family photo on the mantel, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, every memento from our life now seemed like evidence in a case I was only beginning to understand. Louis's study had always been his sanctuary, the one room in the house where I rarely ventured without an invitation. He'd claimed he needed absolute quiet to concentrate on his clients' accounts, and I'd respected that boundary for our entire marriage. A man needs his cave, he used to joke, and I'd laughed along, never questioning why the door was always locked when he wasn't home. Now, standing in the doorway with the brass key ring, the funeral home had returned to me. I felt like an archaeologist about to uncover a lost civilization. The room smelled of leather and his cologne, that expensive brand he'd started wearing a few years ago, claiming his old aftershave was too mature for a man who still felt young at heart. The mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface meticulously organized, just as Louis had left it. His fountain pen lay precisely parallel to a leather desk pad, and his reading glasses were folded neatly beside a stack of financial magazines. But it was the bottom drawer, the one with the small brass lock, that drew my attention like a magnet. My hands trembled as I sorted through the keys. Louis had always been secretive about that drawer, claiming it contained sensitive client information that couldn't be left unsecured. Even during his final illness, when I'd offered to help organize his papers, he'd insisted on handling it himself, dragging his weakened body to the desk, even when he could barely stand. The third key fit perfectly. The drawer slid open with a soft whisper, revealing a contents that made my breath catch in my throat. Inside was a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before, its cover worn smooth from handling. Beneath it lay manila folders stuffed with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be bank statements from institutions I didn't recognize. The journal's first entry was dated just 6 weeks before Louis's death, written in his familiar handwriting, though the letters were shakier than usual, a side effect of his medication and declining health. I don't have much time left, and there are confessions I can no longer carry to my grave. The weight of what I've done, the lies I've built our life upon, have become unbearable in these final weeks. If Christine finds this journal, she deserves to know the truth, even if it destroys her faith in everything we shared. My heart hammered as I read on, each word searing itself into my memory like a brand. The affair with Victoria began 18 years ago, not 7, as Henry believes. She was 23, fresh out of college, eager and ambitious in ways that reminded me of myself at that age. What started as inappropriate flirtation during late nights at the office became something I told myself I could control. I was wrong. 18 years. I calculated quickly. That meant the affair had begun when Henry was still in high school, when we were still intimate as husband and wife, when I was planning surprise birthday parties and anniversary dinners, completely unaware that I was living a lie. I set Victoria up in an apartment on the other side of town, paid for with money I diverted from our joint savings. Christine never questioned my explanations about market fluctuations or necessary reinvestments. Her trust in my financial expertise became the foundation of my deception. I felt physically ill as I read about how systematically he'd stolen from our marriage, funding his double life with money I'd helped earn, money I'd trusted him to invest wisely for our future, the raises I'd forgone, the vacations I'd suggested we skip to save money, the small luxuries I'd denied myself, all while he was spending thousands on his mistress. But the next entry revealed something even more devastating. The fabricated evidence against Christine was Victoria's idea. She'd grown tired of being the other woman and wanted legitimacy, a real place in my life. When I hesitated to leave my wife, Victoria suggested we create a scenario that would make divorce not only acceptable, but necessary. My hand shook so violently I could barely turn the page. We hired a private investigator not to follow Christine, but to create false evidence against her. The photographs Henry believes show his mother with other men are carefully staged using actors and digital manipulation. The bank statements showing secret accounts and excessive spending are forgeries, created with the help of a corrupt employee at First National who owed Victoria a favor from her college days. The room spun around me as the full scope of their conspiracy became clear. They hadn't just had an affair. They'd orchestrated an elaborate frame job designed to destroy my reputation and justify abandoning me. Every piece of evidence Henry had seen was a lie, carefully crafted to turn my own son against me. I convinced Henry to meet Victoria 3 years ago, introducing her as a colleague who could help him understand the truth about his mother. Victoria played her role perfectly, the reluctant truth-teller, the woman who cared too much about our family to watch Henry continue defending someone unworthy of his loyalty. I remembered that period clearly now, though I'd been too naive to understand what was happening. Henry had started questioning me about small purchases, asking pointed questions about my whereabouts on certain days, developing a suspicious edge that had bewildered me. I'd attributed it to work stress or relationship problems, never imagining that his own father was poisoning his mind against me. The will was changed not to benefit Henry, but to ensure Victoria would have access to our assets through him. She's convinced our son that she's the stable, maternal figure he needs, someone who won't squander his inheritance the way his reckless mother would. In reality, she's been planning to marry him within a year of my death, securing her position as his wife and gaining control of everything I've built. The journal slipped from my numb fingers. Victoria wasn't just Lewis's mistress. She was targeting my son, manipulating a grieving young man who thought he was protecting his father's legacy. The age difference, the timing of her sudden prominence in Henry's life, it all made horrible sense now. But there was more. The folders beneath the journal contained even more damning evidence. Bank records showing regular transfers to accounts in Victoria's name, hotel receipts for romantic getaways I'd never taken, credit card statements for purchases I'd never made, all bearing forged signatures that looked remarkably like my own handwriting. One photograph made me gasp aloud. It showed me having lunch with Dr. Morrison, Lewis's elderly business partner, at a restaurant downtown. But in the doctored version tucked behind it, Dr. Morrison had been replaced with a younger, handsome stranger, and our innocent business lunch looked like an intimate rendezvous. The skill of the manipulation was breathtaking. Even I might have believed it was real if I hadn't lived the truth. The final entries in the journal revealed the depth of Louis's remorse in his dying days. I see clearly now what I've become, not just an adulterer, but a destroyer of innocent lives. Christine never deserved this. She was faithful, loving, trusting to a fault. She supported my career, raised our son, maintained our home, and asked for nothing in return but honesty and fidelity. I gave her neither. Henry doesn't know what I've done to turn him against his mother. He believes he's acting on evidence and his own moral convictions. When he learns the truth, and someday he must, it will devastate him. But Victoria has made it clear that if I try to recant now, if I attempt to tell Henry the truth, she'll reveal other secrets that would destroy our son's future entirely. Other secrets. What else had Louis done? What leverage did Victoria have over him that was powerful enough to keep him silent, even in his final days? I found the answer in the very last entry, dated just 1 week before his death. The money is gone. Not just the funds I stole from our marriage, but money that doesn't belong to me at all. I've been embezzling from clients' accounts for 5 years, covering losses from failed investments with money from other accounts. Victoria knows about all of it. She helped me create the false statements and documents. If the truth comes out, Henry will not only lose his inheritance, but face potential criminal charges as my beneficiary. I'm trapped by my own cowardice and Victoria's ambition. She holds our son's future hostage, while positioning herself to inherit everything through marriage to him. My death will trigger an investigation that will eventually uncover everything. But by then it will be too late to protect Henry or make amends to Christine. If my wife ever reads this, I pray she can find it in her heart to forgive a man who loved her even as he betrayed her in every way possible. And I pray she can save our son from the woman who orchestrated our family's destruction. The journal ended there, but a loose piece of paper fell from between its pages. In Louis's trembling handwriting were instructions. Emergency contact Detective James Walsh, Financial Crimes Division. Tell him about the Morrison account and the Riverside Fund. He'll understand. I sat in Louis's chair as dawn light began to filter through the study windows, holding the evidence of my husband's betrayal and the roadmap to my vindication. The truth was devastating. My marriage had been a lie for nearly half its duration. My son had been systematically turned against me, and my future had been stolen by a woman who saw our family as nothing more than assets to be acquired. But it was also liberating. After 34 years of questioning myself, of wondering why my husband seemed distant, why my son had grown cold, why nothing felt quite right in our picture-perfect life, I finally had answers. More importantly, I had ammunition. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. Through the study window, I could see Henry's car in the driveway, with Victoria in the passenger seat checking her makeup in the mirror. They were early, probably hoping to catch me unprepared, vulnerable, ready to accept defeat. Instead, they were about to discover that the woman they'd underestimated for so long was finally ready to fight back. I slipped the journal into my purse and stood up, straightening my spine with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. Let them come. I was no longer just the grieving widow or the bewildered mother. I was a woman armed with the truth, and that made me dangerous. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house like a death knell, but I no longer felt like the condemned woman I'd been yesterday. The journal in my purse had transformed me from victim to witness, from the accused to the accuser. I took a deep breath and walked to the front door, my footsteps steady and purposeful on the hardwood floors. Henry stood on the porch with Victoria beside him, both looking expectant and slightly impatient. Behind them, a moving truck idled in the driveway, its uniformed crew already unloading dollies and boxes. The sight of strangers preparing to pack up my life should have devastated me, but instead it strengthened my resolve. "You're early," I said, opening the door but not stepping aside to let them in. "We have a lot to accomplish today," Victoria replied smoothly, already moving past me into the foyer. "The movers need to inventory everything, and Henry wants to make sure you understand exactly what you're entitled to take." Henry followed her inside, avoiding my eyes. He looked tired, older than his 35 years, and I wondered if some part of him was struggling with what he was doing to his own mother. But Victoria's presence seemed to reinforce his resolve, her hand possessively resting on his arm like a reminder of where his loyalties now lay. "Before we begin," I said quietly, "there's something I need to show you. Henry, something your father left behind." Victoria's head snapped toward me, her green eyes sharp with suspicion. "What kind of something? A journal? A confession?" Actually, I reached into my purse and withdrew the leather-bound book, watching as Henry's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion. "Dad never kept a journal," he said uncertainly. "He did in his final weeks, when he knew he was dying and wanted to set things right." I held the journal out to him. He documented everything: Henry, the truth about our marriage, about Victoria, about the lies he told you. Victoria stepped between us before Henry could take the journal. "This is obviously a desperate attempt to let him see it," I interrupted firmly. "If it's a fake, if I've somehow manufactured evidence to save myself, then you have nothing to fear. But if it's real..." I looked directly at Victoria, letting my words hang in the air like a challenge. Henry hesitated, then reached around Victoria to take the journal. As he opened it and began reading, I watched his face change, first confusion, then shock, then a growing horror as the magnitude of his father's deception became clear. "This can't be real," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Louis's handwriting was unmistakable, and the intimate details in the confession were things only my husband would have known. Victoria tried to look over his shoulder, but Henry instinctively turned away from her, clutching the journal protectively. As he read, I saw the exact moment when he reached the section about Victoria's manipulation of him, about her long-term plans to marry him and gain control of his inheritance. His face went pale, and he looked up at her with dawning realization. "You've been lying to me," he said quietly. "Everything you told me about caring for Dad, about wanting to protect his memory, it was all to get close to me. Henry, don't let her poison your mind with fabricated..." "This isn't fabricated." His voice cracked with emotion. "I know Dad's handwriting. I know his way of expressing himself. This is real, and it means..." He looked at me with eyes full of devastation and dawning remorse. "Oh God, Mom, what have I done to you?" Before I could respond, Victoria snatched the journal from his hands. "Even if this is real, it doesn't change anything legal. The will stands, the house transfer is valid, and Christine still needs to leave." "Actually," I said calmly, "I think you'll find that's not entirely accurate. especially once the authorities learn about the embezzlement. The word hung in the air like a bomb. Victoria's face went white, and Henry stared at me in confusion. "What embezzlement?" he asked. "The money your father stole from his clients over the past 5 years, nearly $3 million. According to his confession, money he used to fund his double life, to pay for Victoria's apartment, her jewelry, her lifestyle." I looked directly at Victoria. Money she knew was stolen. Victoria's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand the complexities of investment management. Sometimes funds need to be temporarily reallocated." Temporarily. I pulled out photocopies of the bank statements I'd found in the locked drawer. Systematic withdrawals from elderly clients' retirement accounts, funneled through shell companies, then transferred to accounts in your name. There's nothing temporary about theft. Victoria. Henry sank into the nearest chair, the journal still clutched in his hands. $3 million from clients who trusted him, and he looked up at me with haunted eyes. "Are we going to lose everything? Will I be held responsible?" "That depends," I said gently, "on what you choose to do now. Your father left instructions about contacting Detective James Walsh in the Financial Crimes Division. He wanted the truth to come out, even if it destroyed his reputation." The sound of car doors slamming outside drew our attention. Through the window, I could see 2 unmarked sedans parked behind the moving truck. Men in suits were walking up the front path, their badges clearly visible. Victoria tried to run, but Henry caught her arm. "No," he said firmly. "We're not running from this. We're going to face whatever comes." The lead detective introduced himself as James Walsh, the same man Lewis had mentioned in his final note. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. When I mentioned Lewis's confession, his expression grew very serious. "We've been investigating Morrison and Associates for several months," he explained as we gathered in the living room. Anonymous tips about irregularities in client accounts, discrepancies in investment returns. But we needed proof, and your husband was very careful about covering his tracks. "Until now," I said, handing him the journal and supporting documents. Detective Walsh spent 20 minutes reviewing the evidence, occasionally asking questions that Victoria refused to answer and Henry couldn't. Finally, he looked up. "Mrs. Patterson, based on what I'm seeing here, you are clearly unaware of your husband's illegal activities. The forged signatures, the fabricated evidence against you. This actually supports your innocence rather than implicating you." And the relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the pain in Henry's eyes as he realized how completely he'd been manipulated. "What about me?" he asked quietly. "Am I going to be charged as an accessory?" Detective Walsh studied him thoughtfully. "That depends on your level of cooperation and what we discover about your actual knowledge of the crimes. Based on your mother's statement and this journal, it appears you were as much a victim of manipulation as she was." And Victoria finally spoke, her voice sharp with desperation. "This is ridiculous. I was never involved in any financial crimes. Lewis handled everything himself. I was just his girlfriend, nothing more." "Ma'am," Detective Walsh said patiently, "we have security footage of you making deposits at 3 different banks using accounts tied to the stolen funds. We have record of you co-signing loan applications using falsified financial statements. And now we have your boyfriend's detailed confession describing your role in planning and executing this fraud." As they led Victoria away in handcuffs, she turned back to Henry with venom in her eyes. "You're going to regret this. Without me, you'll have nothing. Your precious mother will bleed you dry just like she did your father." Even in defeat, she was still trying to manipulate him, still trying to poison his mind against me. but Henry just looked at her with disgust and turned away. After the police left, taking boxes of evidence and promising to return with a warrant for a more thorough search, Henry and I sat in the sudden quiet of our disrupted home. The moving crew had been dismissed, their services no longer needed. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believed everything they told me. I was so convinced that Dad was protecting me from you, that you were the problem in our family, and you were manipulated by experts," I said gently, moving to sit beside him on the couch where I'd read him bedtime stories 30 years ago. "Your father and Victoria spent 3 years building a case against me, creating evidence, playing on your love for your dad and your desire to do right by him. But I should have known better. I should have trusted you, listened to you, given you a chance to defend yourself." I took his hand, marveling at how much it looked like his father's, but hoping it would be guided by a more honest heart. "We can't change the past, Henry, but we can decide what we do now. Your father made terrible choices, but in the end, he tried to make things right. That has to count for something. The road ahead would be difficult. Legal proceedings, investigations, the slow process of untangling years of financial crimes. Some of the stolen money might be recovered, but Louis's reputation was destroyed forever. Our family would have to rebuild from the ashes of betrayal and deceit, but for the first time in years, I felt hope. The truth was finally out, and my son was beginning to see me clearly again. It would take time to heal the wounds that lies had created, but at least now we could begin with honesty. The house was still mine. The inheritance was still complicated, and the future was uncertain. But I was no longer facing it alone. The weeks following Victoria's arrest passed in a blur of legal appointments, police interviews, and newspaper headlines that made our private nightmare painfully public. Local accountant's widow cleared an embezzlement scandal, read the front page of the Tribune, alongside a photo of me leaving the courthouse after my final interview with Detective Walsh. The vindication felt hollow. Being proven innocent couldn't erase the damage that had already been done to my family. Detective Walsh had kept his word about building an airtight case. Victoria's arrest had triggered a domino effect, revealing the stunning scope of Louis's financial crimes. What had started as a $3 million embezzlement investigation had grown into something far more sinister. Working with forensic accountants, the police had uncovered a sophisticated network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent investments that had defrauded clients of nearly $7 million over 5 years. "Your husband was methodical," Detective Walsh explained during one of our meetings. "He targeted elderly clients, people who trusted him completely and rarely questioned their statements. He'd create false investment reports showing modest gains while actually stealing their principal. By the time they needed to withdraw their money for medical expenses or nursing care, the accounts were nearly empty. The human cost was staggering. 12 families had lost their life savings. Mrs. Carlson, our next-door neighbor, had trusted Louis with her late husband's pension and now faced the possibility of losing her home. The guilt by association was almost unbearable, even though I'd known nothing about Louis's crimes. Victoria's defense had crumbled under the weight of evidence. Security cameras had captured her making deposits at multiple banks. Phone records showed hundreds of calls between her and Louis during business hours, coordinating their schemes. Most damning of all, investigators had found a storage unit rented in her name containing boxes of forged documents and backup drives with detailed records of every fraudulent transaction. She wasn't just Louis's accomplice, Detective Walsh had told me with obvious disgust. In many ways, she was the mastermind. Her background in digital marketing gave her the technical skills to create convincing forgeries, and her youth made clients trust her when she posed as Louis's assistant during phone calls. The revelation that Victoria had been actively participating in client meetings, sometimes impersonating me to build trust with elderly investors, had been particularly sickening. She'd studied my mannerisms, my way of speaking, even worn similar clothing to create the illusion that Louis was a devoted family man working alongside his wife. Henry had taken the revelations especially hard. During one of Detective Walsh's interviews, he'd learned that Victoria had been secretly recording their conversations from the very beginning of their relationship, gathering information about his father's business practices and family dynamics that she could use to perfect her manipulation. She knew things about our family that I told her in confidence. He'd confided to me one evening as we sat in the kitchen, both of us still struggling to process the magnitude of the deception. Personal stories about you, about Dad, about my childhood. She used all of it to convince me she cared about our family's legacy. The trial, when it finally began, was a media sensation. Victoria had hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to paint her as another victim, claiming she'd been coerced by Louis and feared for her safety if she didn't cooperate. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her own recorded conversations with Henry revealed a calculating woman who spoke gleefully about finally getting what she deserved after years of being the other woman. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Victoria couldn't avoid seeing me. She never looked directly at me, but I could see her composure cracking as witness after witness testified about the devastation her crimes had caused. When Mrs. Carlson took the stand, describing how she'd had to move in with her daughter after losing her home, Victoria actually flinched. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented bank records, forged documents, recorded phone calls, and testimony from devastated clients. Henry testified about how Victoria had manipulated him, his voice steady but his hands shaking as he described the elaborate lies she'd told about me. She convinced me my mother was a threat to my father's reputation, he said, looking directly at the jury. She made me believe I was protecting our family by turning against the one person who'd never lied to me. The defense's attempts to shift blame to Louis fell flat. Yes, he had initiated the embezzlement, but Victoria's active participation and manipulation of his son went far beyond the actions of a reluctant accomplice. When she finally took the stand in her own defense, her testimony was unconvincing and contradictory. I loved Louis, she claimed, tears streaming down her face. Everything I did was because I wanted to build a life with him. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. But under cross-examination, her true nature emerged. When the prosecutor pressed her about the forged evidence against me, her mask slipped completely. Christine had everything, she snapped, her voice filled with venom. A beautiful home, a successful husband, a devoted son. She didn't deserve any of it. She was weak, passive, taking everything for granted while I worked for every scrap of affection I got. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison, with restitution orders that would ensure she'd spend the rest of her life paying back the money she'd stolen. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, Victoria turned back one last time. She looked directly at me, her face twisted with rage and defeat. "This isn't over," she mouthed silently. But it was over, finally, completely over. Outside the courthouse, Henry and I faced a crowd of reporters and cameras. Detective Walsh had warned us this moment would come, and we'd prepared a brief statement together. Justice has been served today, Todd, I said, reading from the paper Henry held steady for me. While nothing can undo the pain Victoria Sterling and my late husband caused to their victims, we hope this verdict brings some measure of closure to the families who suffered because of their crimes. Henry stepped forward when I finished. I want to publicly apologize to my mother for the way I treated her during the darkest period of our lives. She was innocent of every accusation made against her, and I was too blinded by manipulation to see the truth. I'm grateful for her forgiveness and for the chance to rebuild our relationship. The questions came fast and loud, but we'd agreed to say nothing more. Hand in hand, we walked away from the courthouse and toward the future we were slowly building together. The financial recovery would take years. Some of the stolen money had been recovered from Victoria's accounts, but much of it was gone forever, spent on her lavish lifestyle and Louis's failed investment schemes. Insurance would cover some of the victims' losses, but many elderly clients would never fully recover their life savings. As for Henry and me, we were learning to trust again. The inheritance issues had been resolved through the courts. The house remained mine, but Henry would receive Louis's legitimate assets once all the legal proceedings were complete. More importantly, we were rediscovering each other as mother and son, building new memories to replace the poisoned ones Victoria had created. The truth had set us free, but freedom came with its own challenges. We were both scarred by betrayal, both learning to navigate a world where the man we'd loved had been capable of such devastating deception. But we were facing it together, and that made all the difference. The first genuine smile I'd seen on Henry's face in months appeared on a crisp October morning, 6 weeks after Victoria's sentencing. We were sitting across from each other in Martha's diner, the little breakfast place where I used to take him for pancakes when he was small. The familiar red vinyl booths and checkered floor brought back memories of simpler times, when the most complicated decision we faced was whether to order chocolate chip or blueberry pancakes. "I've been thinking," Henry said, cutting into his stack of buttermilk pancakes with the same methodical precision he'd inherited from his father, "about Dad's confession, about everything he wrote in that journal." I set down my coffee cup, my stomach tightening with familiar anxiety. Even weeks later, discussing Louis still felt like walking through a minefield. What about it? He said he loved you, even while he was betraying you. Henry looked up, his eyes searching my face. "Do you think that's possible? Can someone love you and destroy you at the same time?" The question had haunted me through countless sleepless nights. How do you reconcile 34 years of marriage with evidence of systematic deception? How do you separate genuine moments of tenderness from calculated manipulation? "I think your father was a man who made terrible choices," I said carefully. "But I also think there were parts of our life together that were real. The early years before Victoria, before the lies started consuming everything. I have to believe those memories are genuine, or I'll go crazy trying to figure out what was true." Henry nodded slowly. "I keep going back to things he taught me when I was a kid. How to throw a curveball, how to change a tire, how to treat people with respect. Were those lessons fake too?" "No, sweetheart. I think your father genuinely wanted to be a good man, a good father. He just lost his way somewhere along the road." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "The man who taught you those lessons was real. The man who chose to steal from his clients and turn you against me, that was someone else entirely." The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text message. I glanced at it and felt my heart skip a beat. It was from Detective Walsh. "Need to meet with you and Henry this afternoon. New developments in the case." Henry saw my expression change. "What is it?" I showed him the message, and we both felt the familiar dread that had become our constant companion over the past few months. Just when we thought the worst was behind us, something new would surface to remind us that Lewis's betrayal had tentacles reaching into corners we hadn't even discovered yet. Detective Walsh met us at the police station, his expression more serious than usual. He led us to the same conference room where we'd first learned about the extent of the financial crimes, and I couldn't help but feel like we were trapped in some horrible recurring nightmare. "We've uncovered additional accounts," he said without preamble, spreading documents across the table. "Hidden assets that your husband established using false identities. The total amount we're now looking at is close to $12 million. $12 million. The number was so enormous it felt abstract, meaningless. How does someone steal $12 million without their spouse noticing? How do you live with someone for decades and remain completely unaware they're capable of such massive deception?" "Where is the money now?" Henry asked, his voice hollow. "That's the complicated part. Some of it is in offshore accounts that Victoria had access to, but didn't know how to reach because your father changed the passwords before he died. Some of it was invested in legitimate ventures that have actually grown in value. And some of it—" Detective Walsh paused, consulting his notes. "Some of it was donated to charity." Donated. I couldn't hide my surprise. "Apparently, your husband had an attack of conscience in his final months. He gave nearly $2 million to organizations supporting victims of financial fraud and elder abuse. Ironic, considering his crimes, but the donations were legitimate and can't be clawed back." Henry laughed bitterly. "So Dad was stealing money to give away money to help people who were victims of exactly what he was doing to his own clients." "It appears so. The human mind is capable of remarkable compartmentalization, especially when guilt and illness are involved." Detective Walsh explained that the discovery of these additional assets would extend the investigation for several more months. More importantly for our family, it meant that Henry's inheritance, which we'd assumed was tainted beyond recovery, might actually include substantial legitimate funds. "What does this mean for us legally?" Henry asked. "It means you'll both need to continue cooperating with our investigation. It means there will be more court hearings, more media attention, more complications. But it also means that the victims of your father's crimes have a much better chance of recovering their losses." That evening, we sat in the living room of the house on Maple Street, my house, legally and emotionally mine again, trying to process this latest revelation. The inheritance money that had seemed like blood money might actually provide a path to redemption. "I want to give it all back," Henry said suddenly. "Every penny that came from Dad's crimes. I don't want any of it. What about your future, your career? You were planning to use that money to start your own business." He shook his head firmly. "I'll find another way. I can't build a life on money that was stolen from elderly people who trusted Dad with their savings. It would be like profiting from their suffering." I felt a surge of pride in my son. Recognition of the moral compass that Victoria and Lewis's lies hadn't been able to destroy. "Your father made terrible choices, but he raised a good man. I think he'd be proud of what you're choosing to do." "Would he—" Henry's voice was full of doubt. "Or would he think I'm being naive, throwing away a fortune because of misplaced guilt?" "I think," I said carefully, "that the father who taught you right from wrong would understand exactly why you're making this choice. The man who wrote that confession, who left evidence to expose his own crimes. That man would want you to do the right thing." As the weeks passed, we began the slow process of rebuilding not just our relationship, but our understanding of who we were as a family. The money became secondary to the more important work of learning to trust each other again, of creating new memories untainted by Lewis's deception. Henry started seeing a therapist to help him process the trauma of being manipulated by two people he'd trusted completely. I began attending a support group for families of white-collar criminals, finding comfort in connecting with others who understood the unique pain of discovering that someone you loved was living a double life. We were healing, slowly but surely. The foundation of our relationship had been cracked by lies, but we were building something new and stronger in its place, something based on truth, forgiveness, and the hard-won knowledge that love requires both trust and vigilance. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future we were creating together. Spring arrived early that year, painting the garden with daffodils and cherry blossoms that seemed to celebrate our family's rebirth. I stood at the kitchen window, watching Henry plant a young oak tree in the backyard, a symbol of new growth and enduring strength. The sapling looked fragile against the vast expanse of lawn, but I knew that with time and care, it would grow into something magnificent. The legal proceedings had finally concluded. Most of the stolen money had been recovered and returned to Louis's victims. Mrs. Carlson had been able to keep her home, and the other elderly clients were slowly rebuilding their financial security. Henry had kept his word, donating his entire inheritance to a fund for victims of financial fraud, keeping only enough to restart his life on honest ground. We had both changed in profound ways. The naive trust that had made us vulnerable to manipulation was gone, replaced by a harder-won wisdom about human nature and the masks people wear. But we'd also discovered reserves of strength we didn't know we possessed. The ability to forgive without forgetting, to love without blindness, to rebuild from complete devastation. Henry walked back toward the house, soil on his hands and peace in his eyes. We'd planted that tree together, just as we were planting the seeds of a new kind of family, one built on truth instead of lies, on earned trust instead of blind faith. The scars of betrayal would always be with us, but they no longer defined us. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Dear friends, this story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when everything we believed in crumbles around us, we possess an incredible power, the power to rebuild, to heal, and to become stronger than we ever imagined possible. Sometimes the people we trust most deeply are the ones who hurt us most profoundly. But betrayal, while devastating, doesn't have to define our future. Like Christine and Henry, we can choose forgiveness over bitterness, truth over comfortable lies, and love over resentment. The most beautiful gardens often grow from the richest soil, soil enriched by what has died and decomposed. Our broken dreams, our shattered trust, our deepest pain can become the foundation for something even more beautiful than what we lost. Remember, you are not defined by what others do to you. You are defined by how you choose to respond, how you choose to heal, and how you choose to love again despite the scars. What's your story of rising from betrayal or loss? How did you find the strength to rebuild? Share your journey in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to join our community of survivors who believe that every ending can become a beautiful new beginning. Your story matters, and you are stronger than you know.